this is also one of the greatest things Heidegger ever said in an interview, was when he's confronted with a quote by Marx, because you mentioned Marx says, philosophers, I'm paraphrasing, have made the mistake of trying to interpret the world. It's time to change the world. Heidegger responds, "But this is a philosophical remark."
That's true. Yeah.
Right. So, and Marx as the subverter of Hegel is not irrelevant when it comes to but also this fetishization of capital, writing it with a capital C. As it's translated into English, and Nick Land is certainly. It would have been interesting to see what Nick Land would have come up with if he hadn't become a Marxist, because if you reduce everything to just, it's just a process and blah, 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 and we can see the future. Well, no, you can't, because the future is literally not given. So it's a corruption of Hegel, not because he makes it material, but because he doesn't understand, because he's also just a follower of Schelling. He doesn't understand that the idea is precisely not given, that there's nothing that's presupposed. So he doesn't understand negativity. But now to come back to not going to defend philosophy or something, but there's a very different way that's also not so different from what you said. So you mentioned the history of thought, or the history of ideas. Well, okay. First of all, maybe there is no history of philosophy. There's just thinking. And that's why, for example, when you read someone like Heidegger, you know that there's something alive and burning in these texts, because he speaks from out of a source. And so does, in some sense, Nietzsche, in another sense, in another sense also Hegel. And by the way, here's something that's profoundly weird. So yes, historiographers can go back and say, this is where the Cartesian moment began. But what if, through thinking, in a way Descartes responds to a possibility, a certain fissure or fraction, that in his response he tears open further, and so brings into being something that was not given or there, but was, okay, to speak metaphysically for a second, was at least a potential. And then now it's actualized. This is a bit simply put, but perhaps that makes it so. So what the weird thing about so-called philosophy is that we are still addressed by the very same questions as, for example, Plato. And hence there is a certain, or Parmenides or Heraclitus, and hence there are recurrence, modes or moments of recurrences throughout what we can so benignly call the history of ideas or the history of philosophy. To stay with Descartes. Descartes says, ego sum ego existo certum est. I am, I exist, this is certain. The popular notion is, I think, therefore I am, which I don't think he says in the Meditations, but this is written in a letter. Now, when you hear ego cogito ego sum, which is, of course, as a formula, almost meaningless, but what it is a repetition, a recurrence of what already disclosed itself to Parmenides. Parmenides articulates the sameness or the unity or the identity, depending on who you read and how we read it, of being and thinking. So Descartes, I don't know if Descartes read Parmenides, probably not. Probably those texts weren't really widely available. But when he begins to think, and hence he is in thinking. It is a very different response to the response of Parmenides, but it is still within the same sort of, once you begin to think, you will end up there. And you will have to articulate it, but it is in this moment that he begins to say, it is I who think, and therefore there is being. which,
Okay.
we can go over this, but we don't have to, because I don't think that we can also look back and just blame Descartes for everything or so. But there's something peculiar about this time period that we call modernity. So in a sense, because you mentioned this, that this is already the subject-object dichotomy. Sorry, this is very important what you said. So I want to stress this again. What Sean said was that this is already the split between mind and body in the sense of a computational device and the body as the machine. So potentially, why not assume that there is something inside the computer in that other machine? Because Descartes does say that the body is a machine and the animal is a machine. So, but in some way, not to say Descartes is to blame, maybe there is something really uncanny, genuinely weird that begins to happen around this time for whatever reason, that it fully breaks through so that this spirals out towards where we are now and unfolds in this manner, which then leads to Nick Land saying there's nothing human in the future, for example.
Yes,
There's still a human being who says it.
Yes, that's true. Well, I think you raise a good point, especially going back to figures like Parmenides and you touched upon this kind of split, this Cartesian split reproducing itself. And I think that's something that I touch upon as well in my book and in the upcoming lectures with you, that the Cartesian split is something that reproduces itself. And it's not necessarily the Cartesian split. It is almost like a rehashing of this kind of being becoming dichotomy that was, one could say, between between Parmenides and Heraclitus in a way, one could say. I'm probably less versed on the details there than you are, but the point being that the interesting thing that technology does here, or let's say the philosophy of technology, the study of technology, the study of the realm of technics, as you call it, is that you are given the kind of unique opportunity in a way to cycle through the history of thinking that we've talked about, to cycle through it again, but from a reversed perspective. Like I would say that the perspective until then, or the metaphysical perspective until then, had been one of looking at it from the past, looking at it from a growing system of metaphysics, whereas now the philosophy of technics enables you to look at it again, which doesn't mean that it is in itself some sort of, let's call it solution, some sort of saving element. But in the case now, for example, of Descartes, one has to say there was a unprecedented preparatory development in techniques and technology building up to the age of Descartes, which involved, among other things, the development of the printing press. And I would say you had the philosophical split, but think about it. How many people in antiquity, in classical antiquity, would be capable of this form of thinking, would even have this form of thinking materialized in their everyday kind of world? It was usually reserved to a small proportion of thinkers, of people that are literate and things like that. And obviously literacy wasn't skyrocketing in Descartes' time either. However, what had changed is, especially with cultural elements like Christianity, the written word, which is a technology, it is already a sort of technical precursor to the abstraction. It is a technical precursor where you've got the word, the unchanging word, black on white somewhere, and it does no longer, the symbols no longer represent themselves. They are only signifiers to a sort of abstracted off-worldly meaning. And you could say, in a way, Platonism, which had been a cult in antiquity, had materialized itself to a dominant cultural force by means of Christianity and throughout the Middle Ages. And what you have then is sort of the Cartesian split, you could say, was the big act of the philosophical dichotomy breaking out into the central stage in a way. And So, and that reproduces itself, as you correctly said. I would say things like even in modern physics, you get problems like the discrete and the continuous, which you have in mathematics with the real numbers and the rational numbers. And in physics, you got the issue in quantum mechanics of the so-called reduction of the wave function, where you've got a continuous description of a continuous wave that represents the particle, but we still want the particle to be in a place at a certain time. So the measurement then positions it, and it is always, it has remained a philosophical mystery as to how that transition happens from the continuous to the discrete. And it is nothing else but a recycled philosophical issue. And we work with these models, these mathematical models work,
Yeah.
but there is no agreement on how to solve this. The common one is called the so-called Copenhagen interpretation by Niels Bohr, which is just complementariness. It's positivist. We have two wave natures and they both exist, and that's that. We're not going to try to further throw metaphysical baggage at it.